What would you do if your neighborhood HOA decided that your land, your private property, was suddenly theirs to control? What if they started fining you, threatening you, and, worst of all, trying to destroy a piece of your family's history just because it didn't fit their so-called community standards? That's exactly what happened to me. And by the time I was done, the HOA wasn't just defeated, they were erased. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night as Karen, the HOA president, stood at the barricade, her face twisted in rage. She was screaming at the officers, demanding answers, demanding control. But for the first time in her life, no one was listening to her. Beyond the towering wrought iron gate, the one I had installed with my newly acquired legal authority, a federal protection notice gleamed under the streetlights. Right beside it, a polished National Historic Landmark plaque sealed Karen's fate. I crossed my arms, watching the scene unfold with calm satisfaction. "Actually, Karen," I said, tilting my head ever so slightly, "I can." And I just did. A heavy silence filled the air. The HOA board members behind her stood frozen, their wide-eyed stares bouncing between me and the officers, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. I turned toward the camera, the one capturing every second of this moment for the world to see. Let me tell you how my land, the very thing they tried to erase, just became their worst nightmare. But to understand how we got here, we have to rewind a few weeks. My family's land had stood for over 150 years, long before this neighborhood of beige, overpriced McMansions existed. The farm was passed down from my grandfather, a relic of the past that I had preserved with care. But Karen and her HOA lapdogs didn't see it that way. To them, it was an eyesore, a blemish on their perfectly curated world of manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. And they wanted it gone. It started small, passive-aggressive letters about how my barn didn't align with neighborhood aesthetics. I laughed at first. How could they enforce rules on land they didn't even own? But then the fines started rolling in. $500 a day for non-compliance. The audacity of it nearly made me choke. I wasn't even a member of their HOA. And yet, they acted like they owned my property. Determined to put an end to the nonsense, I walked into their next board meeting, legal documents in hand, ready to shut them down. I expected resistance, I didn't expect outright dismissal. Karen barely glanced at my paperwork before waving a hand as if I was some inconvenience. "The board has already decided," she said smoothly, taking a sip from her overpriced boutique tea. "If your property negatively impacts neighborhood aesthetics, we have the right to enforce compliance." I clenched my jaw. "You don't have jurisdiction over my land." Karen leaned forward, a smirk playing at her lips. "We'll see about that." And that was when things took a turn for the worse. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Karen sitting in her pristine, HOA-approved home, grinning as she counted every dollar they were squeezing out of me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control. The HOA wanted to break me, force me to submit to their rules even though I was never part of their community in the first place. And Karen, she wanted to win. But she had underestimated me. The next morning, I woke up to something far worse than another fine. A thick envelope from the county zoning office sat in my mailbox, the words, "Property Annexation Confirmation," stamped in bold across the front. My stomach turned as I flipped through the pages. Somehow, overnight, my land had been forcibly annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction. I stormed into my lawyer's office, slamming the paperwork onto his desk. Mark Ellison, a man who had spent decades fighting corrupt local governments, whistled as he flipped through the pages. "This is bad," he admitted. "Karen's not just flexing HOA rules. She found a way to redraw the property boundaries, making your land legally part of the HOA." I clenched my fists. "Can they do that?" Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Not legally, no. But I'd bet money she paid someone at the zoning office to push it through. He looked at me over the papers. Reversing this will be a nightmare. And just like that, I was no longer just fighting unfair fines. I was fighting an illegal land grab. That night, as I sat on my porch, reviewing the security footage from my property, I noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., two figures in dark clothing lurked near my barn, flashlights scanning the walls. I zoomed in. They weren't just scoping the place out, they were measuring. Taking notes. A chill ran down my spine. Something was coming. And it wasn't going to be another fine. The very next night, my barn burned. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the distant sound of sirens. By the time I sprinted outside, firefighters were already dousing the flames, but it was too late. The left side of the barn, the part that had stood since the Civil War, was blackened and crumbling. My stomach twisted as I watched a century and a half of history collapse into ash. Karen arrived at my property before the fire was even out. She stood at the edge of the road, arms crossed, her lips curling into a smirk as she spoke to a news reporter. "This is exactly why the HOA had concerns about the structure," she said, shaking her head with fake sympathy. "It was always a fire hazard." I took a step forward, fists shaking. She had planned this. The fire department's report was infuriating. Arson was suspected, but without direct evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. The security footage I had only showed two masked figures near my barn the night before. It wasn't enough. For the first time, I felt helpless. Karen had just taken a piece of my family's legacy, and I had no way to prove it. That's when Mr. Harris, my old neighbor, pulled me aside. He lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. "Listen," he whispered, "if your farm qualifies as a historic landmark, they can't touch it. Ever." I stared at him. A historic landmark. The word sank in like a lifeline. That night, I buried myself in research, scouring every historical database, every property record, every handwritten note my grandfather had stored in an old chest. I needed proof, something ironclad, something that not even Karen could dispute. And then, I found it. A forgotten ledger from 1863, detailing provisions supplied to Union forces from my family's farm. It was all there, dates, transactions, even a note about a local militia using my barn as a supply depot. This wasn't just old farmland. It was history. I immediately called Dr. Samuel Whitaker, a historian who had built his reputation on uncovering forgotten historical sites. The moment he arrived at my farm, his enthusiasm was contagious. He ran his hands over the beams, examined the original foundations, and let out a low whistle. "This isn't just old," he murmured. "It's irreplaceable." He cross-referenced my documents with state archives, and that's when the final puzzle piece clicked into place. My great-great-grandfather had officially registered the land as a military supply station in the 1800s. With that, I had everything I needed. The barn wasn't just a relic. It was federally protected history. And Karen had no idea what was coming. The moment I submitted the application for National Historic Landmark status, I knew I had painted a target on my back. Karen wasn't just going to sit quietly and let me take away her power, she was going to fight dirty. And I was right. It started small. More fines. More threats, ***, a letter from the HOA claiming my livestock violated neighborhood harmony, as if my cows were personally disrupting their aesthetic vision. A fake complaint about unpermitted construction, despite the fact that I hadn't changed a single thing on my property. It was nothing more than harassment, and I ignored it. Then came the night they tried to frame me for a crime. I woke up to a banging on my front door. I pulled on a shirt, grabbed my phone, and opened it to find two uniformed officers standing under my porch light. "Mr. Calloway, we need to talk," one of them said. His tone was polite, but firm. We've received a report of vandalism on your property. Vandalism? My stomach tightened. They led me out to my barn. My jaw clenched as I took in the spray-painted words defacing the wood, racial slurs, obscenities, and even threats. The whole thing was designed to make me look like a lunatic trying to stir up trouble. Karen was already there, wrapped in a pristine coat like she had just stepped out of a catalog, smug as ever. She put a hand on her chest, shaking her head dramatically. "I just don't understand why someone would do this," she sighed. "Maybe the pressure of this whole situation is getting to you, Jake." And then it hit me. She was trying to frame me. Make it look like I had staged this whole thing for sympathy, so when the police couldn't find a suspect, she could spin the story in her favor. But Karen had underestimated me. I pulled out my phone, opened my security app, and tapped on the latest footage. The screen lit up, showing two masked figures sneaking onto my property in the dead of night, spray cans in hand. The officers leaned in, watching as the trespassers tagged the barn, laughing to themselves, before running off into the darkness. Karen's face paled. "Guess that clears things up," I said smoothly, turning the phone so the officers could get a good, long look. The HOA members who had done this? They were on Karen's board. One of the officers turned to her, face unreadable. "Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you at the station." Karen stammered, but the damage was done. Her people had been caught red-handed, and even though she wouldn't be arrested that night, the story was already slipping out of her control. And I wasn't done yet. Because in the middle of all this chaos, I had stumbled upon the one secret that would destroy her forever. It started with a single document, slipped into my mailbox with no return address. A list of property transactions and financial records tied to the HOA. It didn't take long to see the pattern, because Karen's husband wasn't just another homeowner, he was the owner of a shady construction company, already in talks with developers to purchase my land. The plan had been in motion long before they ever started finding me. The HOA had never cared about neighborhood aesthetics. They had wanted my land to build luxury condos. And Karen? She was expecting a hefty kickback once the deal went through. I leaked everything. Within 24 hours, the local news was all over it. HOA president accused of land grab for profit. Community in uproar over secret developer deal. Calls for HOA president's resignation amid scandal. The homeowners who had been backing Karen? They started turning on her, the ones who had always hated her. They were ready to burn her at the stake. I thought that would be the end of it. That Karen would quietly resign and slink away. But she wasn't done fighting. Because a few nights later, I caught her breaking into the HOA office. It was 3 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a security alert. I groggily reached for it, expecting another trespasser on my property. Instead, the motion-activated camera feed showed Karen, dressed in all black, sneaking into the HOA headquarters. She wasn't alone. She and one of her remaining loyalists were inside, shredding stacks of documents. They were trying to destroy the evidence before the investigation could catch up to them. But there was just one tiny problem. She had triggered the building's alarm. I didn't even have to call the cops. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights flooded the parking lot. Officers stormed inside, catching Karen red-handed as she stood there with a pile of shredded documents at her feet, looking like a trapped rat. She tried to lie her way out of it, of course. Claimed she was cleaning up outdated files. But the moment the officers asked her about the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the HOA's maintenance fund, her face went bone white. Karen was finished. By sunrise, she was hauled into the police station for questioning. The town erupted. Residents flooded the HOA office, demanding the entire board resign. The petition to dissolve the HOA entirely racked up hundreds of signatures in a single day. Karen had spent months trying to erase me. Now, she was the one being erased. By the time Karen was being interrogated at the police station, the entire town had turned against her. The once feared HOA president was now nothing more than a disgraced, scrambling bureaucrat trying to cling to whatever power she had left. But the truth was, she had already lost. And I was about to deliver the final blow. The very next morning, I got a call from my lawyer, Mark Ellison. His voice was practically buzzing with amusement. "You're gonna love this," he said, barely able to contain his laughter. "Turns out the only road leading into the neighborhood, the one every single resident has to drive through every day?" I already knew where this was going, but I let him finish. "It technically runs through your property. And once your farm gets full National Historic Landmark status, you can legally restrict access to it." I nearly dropped my phone. The HOA had spent months trying to erase me. Now, I had the legal power to erase them instead. I wasted no time filing the paperwork to shut down the road. Within days, it was official. The residents who had backed Karen's reign of terror would soon find themselves trapped, ***, cut off from their own neighborhood, all because they had followed her blindly, ***. News of the road closure spread like wildfire, panic set in. Homeowners bombarded the HOA office, demanding answers. The remaining board members tried everything, contacting local officials, pushing bogus legal threats, even trying to bribe a city planner to have my land status revoked. Nothing worked. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for them, Karen tried one last, pathetic move. One afternoon, I found a court summons stuffed in my mailbox. The HOA was suing me. Their argument? That I had manipulated historical laws to intentionally harm the community, and that my road restriction was a malicious act meant to punish them. I laughed. Karen must have been truly desperate to think this lawsuit would hold up in court. But I wasn't just going to win, I was going to bury them. I leaked the lawsuit to the press. Within hours, it was all over the news. HOA sues farmer for protecting historic land. Local HOA accused of attempting to seize private property. Corrupt HOA exposed, president already under investigation for embezzlement. The internet had a field day, social media exploded with people sharing their own HOA horror stories, mocking Karen and her board for their greed and incompetence. When the case finally made it to court, the judge didn't just dismiss it, he scolded them for wasting everyone's time. "This isn't a legal dispute," he said, barely hiding his annoyance. "This is a temper tantrum." That was it. The HOA was dead. One by one, the remaining board members resigned. Without leadership, without power, and with no legal authority left, the homeowners held a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. It passed. Unanimously. And just like that, the tyrannical rule that had terrorized this neighborhood for years was gone. The day my road restriction officially went into effect, I threw a celebration. I invited everyone, except for Karen, of course. There was barbecue, music, drinks, and the highlight of the evening: a dunk tank. We set up a mannequin dressed like Karen, complete with a smug expression and a clipboard labeled "violation notices." For $5 a throw, people could hurl baseballs at the target and send Karen plunging into the water. Let's just say, by the end of the night, she spent a lot of time soaking wet. But Karen? She still wasn't ready to admit defeat. She tried one last time to rally support, handing out flyers claiming that I had *** destroyed property values *** and *** ruined the neighborhood *** with my selfish actions. Nobody bought it. The very people she had controlled for years were now thriving without her ridiculous rules. Some painted their houses bright colors that would have violated HOA codes. One guy installed a giant pink flamingo statue in his yard just because he could. A family down the street built a backyard mini-golf course without asking for permission. And just like that, the neighborhood came back to life. But the final blow? That came when a particularly nosy retired accountant, Mr. Walter Bishop, decided to dig into the HOA's old financial records. And what he found? Over $100,000 in missing HOA funds. There was no maintenance fund, there were no community improvement projects. The money was gone. And the only person who had access to those funds? Karen. The moment the news broke, the IRS got involved. The last time I saw her, she was storming out of her house, arguing with two federal investigators. They weren't just asking questions, they were building a case. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, and for the first time since this war started, Karen looked scared. She sold her house overnight and disappeared, skipping town before the lawsuits and criminal charges caught up to her. No one missed her. The HOA was gone. The neighborhood was free. And my land? It was mine forever. With the HOA officially dismantled and Karen gone, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Without her iron grip controlling every detail, people finally started living in their own homes instead of just existing under a constant cloud of fines and regulations. One by one, houses were repainted in vibrant colors, turquoise, red, even bright yellow. Some homeowners planted wild, overgrown gardens just because they could. A guy down the street erected a massive inflatable dinosaur in his front yard, grinning as he told the local news. Karen would have lost her mind over this. But my personal favorite? The Pink Flamingo Rebellion. It started with a single elderly woman who had lived in fear of the HOA for years. The morning after the final HOA meeting, she planted 100 plastic flamingos all over her lawn, with a handwritten sign stuck in the middle. "This is for you, Karen." The whole street erupted in laughter. And soon enough, flamingos started popping up everywhere. It became a symbol of victory, a pink, plastic middle finger to the tyranny we had all endured. As for my farm, I did exactly what I had promised. I turned it into something permanent, something bigger than just a spiteful victory over Karen. I converted my historic barn into a museum, showcasing the land's Civil War legacy, the artifacts we had unearthed, and the story of how one farmer had fought back against an HOA and won. Families brought their kids to visit, and local schools even organized field trips to teach students about real American history, history Karen had tried to erase. But the best part? Every year, now hosts the HOA Free Festival, a town-wide celebration where people can enjoy food, music, and most importantly, absolute freedom. And right at the entrance, near the gate where Karen had once screamed in outrage, I installed a brand new monument. "Welcome to Callaway Farm, a National Historic Landmark. HOA free since 2025. Beneath it, in smaller letters, a final message. In loving memory of the HOA, may it never return." That was the end of it. The HOA had been obliterated, Karen had fled in disgrace, and the land that had survived war, greed, and corruption was finally safe. But even now, I can't help but wonder, how many other neighborhoods are still trapped under the rule of power-hungry HOA dictators like Karen? How many people are still fighting fines, restrictions, and absurd rules over land that should be theirs? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.